Everyone has wishes which he would not like to tell to others, which he does not want to admit even to himself. And yet sometimes these unspoken wishes slip through into our dreams, into our art, and even into the way we play a single phrase on the piano. Vladimir Horowitz had a way of revealing the things that were hidden beneath the surface. His playing could be generous, tender, and luminous, but it could also be unsettling, full of a depth that not everyone knew quite how to receive.
I think a genius like Horowitz just defies everything that we're taught, because he had his own way of making music and he had his own way of approaching the piano.
His artistry belonged to another time. He valued the essence of the score beyond what was simply written on the page.
He emphasized things that other people didn't. He shone a light on things that were important to him that I think other people didn't hear.
But for many of his critics, these liberties with the score were indulgences. He was nothing more than a showman who played with particularly unorthodox technique. The composer and critic Virgil Thomson once wrote that Horowitz was a master of musical distortion. Glenn Gould went from a youthful intoxication with Horowitz to seeing him as a representation of the gaudiness of an old-fashioned romantic piano style, as well as critiquing his octaves. And perhaps most shocking is the entry written on Horowitz in the New Grove Dictionary of Music, an entry that would spark a years-long musical debate. After all the necessary biographical and contextual information, the author, Michael Steinberg, goes ahead and critiques Horowitz's ability to play the piano, writing, "Horowitz illustrates that an astounding instrumental gift carries no guarantee of musical understanding." This was one of the only comments of this nature in the encyclopedia. Imagine getting that kind of shade thrown at you in what is supposed to be an official musical document. But critics aside, Horowitz is one of the most influential and beloved pianists of the 20th century, leaving behind a career that must be reckoned with. He was an artist who thrived in contradictions, and even trying to speak about him in generalizations proves problematic when you consider how multifaceted his career really was. Possibly born in Kiev in 1903, his early years were marked by virtuosity and superstardom. At the age of just 20 years old, he performed 23 recitals without repeating a single work, assuring a prodigious start to his career. This dazzling reputation continued on 2 continents, Horowitz moving to the United States in 1944. In 1953, however, he withdrew from live performance for 12 years. His brief returns to the stage in the 1960s and later his legendary 1986 recital in Moscow were moments charged with nostalgia, longing, and an almost painful intensity. That Moscow recital in particular has gone down as one of the most overwhelmingly emotional moments in piano history. Returning to a homeland he had left more than 60 years prior, Horowitz brought a program of some of his greatest hits: Scarlatti, Mozart, Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, Schubert, Liszt, and Chopin. The audience was packed with ambassadors, cultural elites, and civilians alike, with literal hordes of music students breaking through police barriers just to try to get into the overstuffed hall.
Nobody announced that the old man in the car was to be here. The Russian newspapers, radio, and television have ignored him. People just found out and frustrated the best efforts of the Soviet police to send him on his way, and stopped his car dead in the courtyard of the Moscow Conservatory of Music in a wave of love and admiration.
Scriabin's 86-year-old daughter was in the audience, as was the composer Alfred Schnittke, who wrote that the playing was remarkable. There is infinite contrast and finesse. Contrast is certainly something that Schnittke knows quite a lot about. Crowds and critics alike were moved to tears several times throughout the evening. This was Horowitz reaching the end of his life, but at the peak of his musical profundity. However, beyond the monumental program that Horowitz prepared, it was his choice of encore that has really gone down as the most emblematic moment of this entire recital. It was Schumann's humble piece Träumerei from Kinderszenen, which Horowitz played with a deep sense of longing, as though trying to balance past and present, exile and return. This performance would prove to be one of Horowitz's most provocative. In the years after, it would come to represent either the most emotionally rich aspects of Horowitz's playing or an example of his most egregious interpretive excess. In this sense, Schumann is an apt companion to Horowitz. He too was a master of contradictions, living his life split between two personalities, which he imbued into his writings and into his music. There was Florestan, bold, courageous, outgoing, and showy, and on the other hand, Eusebius, shy, introverted, and introspective. For many of his harshest critics, Horowitz was nothing more than an eternal Florestan, a showman who wasn't able to reach the depths necessary to play certain repertoire. But listening to his performance of Träumerei, we hear that Eusebius has been there all along.
I have a devil and the angel inside of me.
Of course, that's very well known.
Otherwise I cannot project.
Let's go back in time to over half a century before Horowitz was even born. The year is 1838, and Robert Schumann is running out of money. His compositions aren't selling. Most of them are too technically demanding, emotionally unstable, and frankly, too unconventional for the general public. And to make matters worse, Robert was forbidden from marrying the love of his life, Clara Wieck. Clara's father looked at Robert's financial situation and was less than impressed with how Robert was arranging his life at the time.
You have no home, you have no wife, you have no money, you have no discernible talents.
Not long before, he had injured his hand, making it impossible for him to perform, so the only way for him to make money was by selling his compositions. Clara was a bit hesitant to perform his works, saying that the public just simply didn't understand them. And let's think about what Schumann was writing around this time. There was the C major Fantasy, the Third Sonata, which is a concerto without orchestra, and Kreisleriana. These are three technically demanding, large-scale, genre-defying works, which were really meant for a large concert hall, not the intimate settings of house music, which were the primary market for selling scores at the time. In order for Schumann to make a buck as a composer, he would need to compose something which would suit this intimate, cozy setting, and something that could be understood by a broad audience. Schumann finally caved into the pressure, writing a piece that was significantly different than what he had written before. Inspired by a comment that Clara once made that Robert seemed like a child to her, Schumann wrote Kinderszenen, a set of 13 short pieces, most of them just a couple of minutes long, each with really fun titles like Of Foreign Lands and People, Happy Enough, and of course, Träumerei, or Dreaming. Schumann had succeeded in crafting something precious and beautiful that could really be understood by a wide range of listeners and players. And though certainly not easy to play, these pieces were much less technically demanding than the things that Schumann had been writing before. The title itself, Kinderszenen, usually translates to scenes from childhood, which implies a looking back to simpler times and emotional worlds. Or so it seems. From the moment these works were published, the romantic imagination would transform them into something far beyond what was written in the score. And the pieces were distributed, sold, and rearranged for different instruments tons of times in the years following the initial publication. However, it was the single movement Träumerei which really began to take on a life of its own. The title translates to dreaming or dreaminess or reverie, and the piece really quickly moved from a depiction of childhood innocence and childhood simplicity into something much more complex. It became a vessel for memory, for nostalgia, for something unreachable, a truly powerful indication of the unrequited love between Robert and Clara that led to the work's composition in the first place. In the decades following the work's publication, and even to this very day, it has inspired novels, poems, films, arrangements, all of which really emphasize the underlying sense of unspoken desire.
저번에 여기서 그 곡 치시는 걸 우연히 들어서요.
슈만 어린이의 정경에 있는 그 곡이요?
As it turns out, the average tempo seems to also have gotten gradually slower over time. And I've had my own history with it. When I was a kid, I used to have a CD player in my bedroom, and I would always, before I go to bed, pick a CD to listen to. I had a couple of favorites. One of them was an album of Schumann's piano works. Another one was Nicktoons' Greatest Hits album, because, you know, I too am a master of contradictions. But anyway, I don't remember now who the pianist of this Schumann album was, but what I do remember is that Träumerei was the piece that always really spoke to me. I would fall asleep to it, drawn into its quiet, humble beauty, its weightless simplicity wrapping around me like a bedtime story, leading me gradually into my own dream world. As a kid, I didn't know anything about Robert Schumann's financial struggles or his desperation to marry Clara or the longing that was behind every single note. All I knew was that it felt safe, like a dream that I could sink into without fear. And then, years later, I heard the recording of Horowitz playing it. Horowitz's Träumerei isn't safe. It doesn't settle neatly into the background, and I don't think it would be that easy to fall asleep listening to this. But what exactly makes it so magical? For one thing, listen to how he develops the opening phrase. And at other times, inner voices punch in violently, like the obstacles, perhaps, that prevent us from being in love. Horowitz does everything he possibly can to make sure that this isn't a dream that you wake up and forget. Horowitz's reputation as the last romantic fits very nicely into the overall narrative that had been building around Träumerei for over a century at this point. Let's compare this approach to a pianist who I think is probably the antithesis of Horowitz, Claudio Arrau. In his interpretation, the melody line is uninterrupted, it's crystal clear, the rhythm very stable, and the rubato very subtle and poetic. There is a really delightful simplicity here, like a child laying in the grass and watching the clouds go by on a spring day. These two interpretive approaches illuminate completely different dimensions to this work. Horowitz's performance, however, resists simplicity. And actually, if we go back to Michael Steinberg's entry in the New Grove Dictionary, it's exactly this resistance to simplicity which he takes issue with in this performance. He writes that Horowitz conceives of interpretation not as the reification of the composer's ideas, but as an essentially independent activity. In Schumann's Träumerei, for example, he places the high points anywhere except where Schumann placed them. It is nearly impossible for him to play simply, and where simplicity is wanted, he is apt to offer a teasing, affettuoso manner, or to steamroller the line into perfect flatness. I certainly don't hear flatness in Horowitz's performance. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's his ability to mine the depths of what appears to be a simple piece for the most rich emotional layers to create something that is timelessly powerful. We often think of dreams as being fantastical worlds with shiny reveries that have no consequence on what happens in our everyday life. But it's much more complicated than that. Just think of how dreams are often portrayed in popular culture, where the subconscious is not just a playground, but rather a battleground. And what happens in the dream world has a very real impact on what happens in the real world.
What the hell are dreams anyway?
The truth is, we still don't know what they are or where they come from.
Schumann's music is also often a dream world in which repressed feelings and subconscious desires are hidden beneath an otherwise simple surface. But just like in Schumann's life, nothing in his music is ever too easy or too simple. The musicologist Richard Taruskin wrote a scathing takedown of Steinberg's critique of Horowitz in the New Grove Dictionary. Taruskin reminded us just how much Horowitz believed in the agency of the listener to interpret the music. He thought we were mature enough to revel along with him in his artifice. His was the most self-aware, most sophisticated kind of art, and he did us the honor of assuming we were as sophisticated as he was, and as aware of his awareness. Horowitz was of course committed to the spirit of the work, but most importantly of all, he was committed to communicating this spirit to the audience.
So much color, each note.
Even the wrong ones?
I don't make it.
Oh, no.
I don't want to have perfection. I'm not Heifetz, no. I'm Horowitz. If there is one note, it's fine. I don't want perfection.
He felt for his own purposes, the position of an audience caused him to be at his moment of giving. The implication was that in the studio, the temptation to tinker is enormous.
In his performances, he wanted to create a shared experience between audience, composer, and performer. By rejecting simplicity in Träumerei, Horowitz invites us to encounter some of the most complex emotions that may be hiding in our own dreams. And when we reach the end of Horowitz's performance in Moscow, we can feel the lifetime of effort that went into playing this one short piece. We feel the weight of the silence between the last notes and the applause. It's a brief second in which lifetimes of unspoken wishes are held. Horowitz and Schumann's Träumerei carries a bittersweet weight. It's a dream that doesn't ever quite come true. Both Horowitz and Schumann carried their own ghosts, their own subconscious wishes which we will never have access to. But when Horowitz plays, it's as if we can feel all of them, and as though time is collapsing, 1838, 1986, and today, all expressed together in this one incredible performance. Thanks so much for joining us, as always. It's such a pleasure to get to talk about some of the most incredible and inspiring moments in piano history with all of you. What do you think of Horowitz's performance of Träumerei? Do you agree with Steinberg, or are you on the, let's say, the right side of history? Sound off in the comments below. It's always super fun to hear from all of you. And if you're interested in exploring piano and piano repertoire even further, then you should check out Tonebase Premium, the platform that makes videos like this possible. On Tonebase Premium, you'll find hours and hours of piano content with lessons for beginners, intermediate, and advanced learners alike. There are exercises if you're just starting, technical regimes to up your piano game, and sophisticated discussions of some of the most important pieces in piano repertoire from some of the world's greatest interpreters. One of my favorite recent additions to the library is the fabulous Juliana Avdeeva's course on Chopin. A winner of the Chopin competition, she is one of the best people that I can think of to be giving advice on these pieces. And that's just one example of the vast array of content that's out there on Tonebase Premium. If you're interested, check the link in the description below to get started with a 14-day free trial. And if you like what you saw, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who you think might be interested. All of this really helps us to keep bringing high-quality piano content to you for free right here on YouTube. I'm Robert Fleitz from Tonebase, and I'll see you next time.
My father says I can't see you until you get your life together.
Or so it seems. Or so you would think.